Look, if copyright strikes weren't a thing, you can bet We Are the Champions would be playing in the background of this video. Hello, my name is Margaret Adele, and welcome to me bragging about doing the thing. For the first time ever, I have beaten the PopSugar Reading Challenge. This one was a lot, but I finally did it. Now, if you're unaware, the PopSugar Reading Challenge is a reading challenge made up of 50 book prompts by the, lifestyle pop culture brand PopSugar. In some circles, their reading challenge is actually, more famous or well-known than the rest of their brand. It's a big deal every year, and I have tried beating this thing so many times before, and the annoying part is that it should have always been easy for me to do because it's only 50 prompts. For reference, I am currently on track to read 145 books for 2022. This should be simple for me, but one, the prompts are very trad focused, or at least they were this year, and a lot of things like read a book that won this specific trad award makes it a little bit harder because I can't just use my normal books. And two, I give up. I tend to give up really early, but when I realized around October that I only had 12 books left in the entire year's challenge, I was like, yes, we're gonna do it. We're gonna beat it, finally. And I beat it with 5 days to spare. Maybe I'll try beating it a little sooner next year. I don't know. But we're going to talk about how I did it and what the books I read were. We will not be going into in-depth on many of them because, again, 50 books, this would be a forever video. So what was my strategy? What made this year different than all the other years? The biggest mistake I made in previous years was, one, trying to plan things out really far into the future where I would sit down and start trying to pick out all the books for the prompts when I know I'm a mood reader and I can't think that far ahead because I'm probably not going to be able to accurately guess what I'm going to want to read at that time. And two, I used a lot of generic social media book lists to find recommendations for it. And a lot of these bloggy type book lists, especially if they're trad based, tend to give recommendations that are very serious, capital L literary book club picks, which isn't the majority of what I read. Not that I don't read serious books, but if I'm reading something serious, I'm doing nonfiction, we are learning a thing, not something about trauma because that's the only books they're recommending for a book by a BIPOC author. I know BIPOC authors are writing the good, kitschy, fun stuff, so if that's the prompt, I want to find one of those, and I'll talk about it when I get to that prompt in this year's go-through. That is just, it didn't work, and I would get really disheartened, and it would feel like a chore, and so usually by May or June, a time when I theoretically could have been done with the entire list, I'd be giving up less than halfway through. This year, I did the opposite. I started reading like I normally would, and at first, I would just look through the books I'd already read, look through the prompts, and see if I could slot any in. And in a lot of cases, there are some prompts that are just easy. A book by a BIPOC author, a book about witches, or about a secret, or kind of generic stuff that it's okay, you actually in some cases can't know if that'll fit until you've read the book. And then for the ones that I absolutely had to read outside the comfort zone, I would arrange to only do 1 or 2 a month. A book for this exact award, or I'd have to specifically look for a duology, that kind of thing. So the actual amount of sitting down and thinking hard about fitting the prompts was a late stage thing, not an entire year thing. And admittedly, I think this next year I'm going to try to do more of the look and find the book that matches ahead of time so that I'm not doing all of that in 1 month, because while I did beat it this year, the only way I could do it was by basically not reading any review books for the month of December. Not a great look for me. So in the future, I'll probably try to even it out more, because I am totally going to try it again for 2023. I'm really excited for this next year because I swear they made it for me, because it's there's a prompt to read a self-pubbed book. There's a prompt to read a book bought from an indie store. I'm all for this. So definitely going to try it again, see if I can't beat it 2 years in a row, see if I've actually unlocked it or if this was just a lucky thing. But now let's jump in and start doing a really quick overview of the actual books I read for this thing. So I'm going to be going down the list. I have it right here. These are not the actual order that I read the books in. I'm literally just going beep, beep, and then we're going to be done. So first up, for a book published in 2022, I read Too Like the Lightning by Travis Bedoin. This is an MLM contemporary romance. Very adorable. I was so giddy when I found out that Travis had released it. I've been waiting for a full book from him for a while after the short story series, and obviously I kind of like put it on here because I wanted it on here. I've actually read a lot of other books published in 2022. Proud of me for that. Next up, we have a book set on a plane, train, or cruise ship. This one I actually did have to like do some searching for. I thought I had some that would work for it, but they didn't quite fit the plane, train, or cruise ship for the majority of the book. So for this one, I went with the classic Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. One of the few books that kept popping up in the you should read this for this prompt discussions online that I actually went with, mostly because I already liked Agatha Christie and I already liked that detective. I never know how to say his name, Hercule Poirot. And then next up, we had a book about or set in a non-patriarchal society. I didn't know how I was going to manage this one, and then I stumbled across the book for it early on, and that is Ensnared by Tiffany Roberts. Yep, monster romance, spider aliens. But the spider aliens colony is all matriarchal, so it counts. Next up, a book with a tiger on the cover, or tiger in the title. I went with a shifter romance because I like them, but Tiger's Claim by Celia Kyle, this one, it was mid. I picked it because it had tiger. I think there's something about a secret society of like shifter super soldiers or something. I don't know. It all slipped from my brain. Next up, we have a sapphic book. Again, another easy one for me. For this one, I went with a review book, Love and Low Gravity by Storm Kaywood. I could have gone with any number of other ones. I think this is just the first sapphic book I read of the year, so that's what went with it, but I did like it. And then next up, we have a book by a Latin author. Of course, I had to give this one to my girl, In Absence by Laura Diaz de Arce. She's one of my OG authors that I review, so of course, when she had a new book to review, even though she was not the only Latin author I read this year, it felt appropriate to give this spot to her book. Next up, we have a book with an onomatopoeia in the title. This one actually kind of floored me for a hot minute because I was like, that's gotta be so rare. But then I remembered that Chitty Chitty Bang Bang by Ian Fleming exists, and because the title is what the car makes as a sound, it counts. Not nearly as good as the movie. Discovered that. Very different. I was like pleasantly surprised when I found out that Ian Fleming had written Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. I was like, wow, he must have really stepped outside of his comfort zone. But when you read the actual book, you're like, no, this is a children's book written by the guy that wrote James Bond. Like, that tracks. Dick Van Dyke made the movie what it is. That's just it. But I am glad that I have read that classic children's book. Up next is a book with a protagonist who uses a mobility aid. For this one, I read Not My Type by Evie Mitchell. This is a contemporary romance all about different women with disabilities finding love. Should this have gone to the high fantasy book in my review list that has a main character that uses a mobility aid? Yes, but that one's chunky high fantasy, and I'm scared. Next up, we have a book about a found family. This one I used Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree, the cozy fantasy that's kind of kicked off recently, and I was thankful enough to read it when it was still an indie book before it got turned into a trad book and everyone had to wait for it to be re-released. Next up, we had an Anisfield Wolf Book Award winner. For this one, I read Obit by Victoria Chang. This was one of those books that, again, I had to go out of my way to find because I'd never even heard of this award before. Was very dark because it's all about grief and death and stuff, but the poems were all written as obituaries, and there were certain sections that were kind of magical realism-y, and I did not get it, but I liked the flow of the words, so that counts, right? Up next is a book talk recommendation. I was real iffy about this one because book talk recommendations 99% of the time don't work for me, but I did discover Strange Love by AGUIRRE, and this was an alien romance. I like those. It was very strange, highly strange. The sex scenes were based on cave insect anatomy, so that one I like to re-up my weird cred sometimes. That one was fun. For a book about the afterlife, I read The Ghosts of Marshley Park by Amanda Innes, all about a teenage ghost trying to solve her own murder. Loved the ghost mechanics. The reveal of the murder was pretty For a book set in the 80s, I read the #1 recommendation I kept getting for this prompt, and that is My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. Here's the thing, I don't really like the 80s. I think that's like a sin for a millennial. So the horror parts of this, really loved. The body horror was excellent, but the sheer amount of name drops of cultural icons and touchstones from the 80s kind of went over my head, and I wasn't really that big of a fan, but you know, it's pretty decent. Next up, we had a book with cutlery on the cover or in the title, and for this one I read In the Hall with the Knife by Diana Peterfreund. This is a retelling essentially of Clue, but set in a boarding school. Pretty good. Won't be continuing with the series because I don't really care about boarding school plots or rich kids at boarding school. Next up, we had a book by a Pacific Islander author. This is one of those ones where when I went to look for recommendations, all I got was like the serious book club trauma books, but someone then suggested Angel's Blood by Nalini Singh. This is a kitschy urban fantasy with like angels and vampires and stuff, and yes, love. And I found out that I have other books by her that I didn't know I had, bought from like secondhand. So awesome. I have a new author that I like and can continue reading. Next up is a book about witches. For this one I went with Serendipity by Kristen Proby. This is the third, I believe, in its trilogy, all about a trio of sister witches who are like finding love and defeating an ancient curse. I honestly liked the finding love part more than the ancient curse part, which is strange for me, but glad I got that one finished. For a book becoming a TV series or movie in 2022, I went with The School for Good and Evil by Soman Chanani. This is one of the ones that was serendipitous because I found out that I already had bought a copy of this secondhand when I went looking for lists of recommendations. I did not watch the series yet, but I might, and I'm definitely continuing with this, even though I have so many series I have to continue. For a romance novel by a BIPOC author, I went with Let Me Show You by Alexandria House. This is the third in the McLean Brothers series. I still need to finish it. I'm so close. But it's adorable black love books written with a lot of spice. I will never view pineapple the same way again. Next up is a book that takes place during your favorite season, Love Light Farms by B.K. Borison. This takes place during the holiday season, which technically I was using for my favorite because spring is also up there, but it's kind of hard to find books that specifically take place in spring. Next up, we have a book whose title begins with the last letter of your previous read, and Tasty Mango by J.J. Knight started with a T, and I believe I read The Poison Heart before this one. I don't remember anything about this book. I think it had a pregnant protagonist and a billionaire love interest. I think that's what it had, but I honestly don't remember. Did not continue with this series. I think I read that one during a really bad day. So I'm going to jump down to the advanced prompts here quick. We have a book with the reflected image on the cover or mirror in the title. For this one, I went with Smoke and Mirrors by Julie Rowe. This is the second in the disease outbreak romance series. It sounds weird to say, but it makes sense in context. Next up, we have a book that features 2 languages. We had Faded by Leela Mina. This is the series that I've reviewed for a while, and it takes place in Japan, and a bunch of languages are actually spoken, English, Japanese, and Italian, and I think some others. So that one's fun. Next up, we have a book with a palindromic title, and I used Bob by Wendy Moss and Rebecca Stead. Cute little mid-grade. Didn't think much of it, but it was cute for what it was. I think I read it in a day. Next up, we have a duology. This prompt was actually a lot trickier than I thought because so many people gave me recommendations for the first in a duology with the second not out yet, but the prompt specifically required you to read both books in the duology. But thankfully, I remember that I had Spin the Dawn by Elizabeth Lim on my shelf already, so all I had to do was pick up Unravel the Dusk. Now, this is a duology. I think it might have been better served as a trilogy because this book is pretty decently paced and gives you a great cliffhanger, but it feels like this book is racing through to wrap up that gigantic cliffhanger. I think I would have preferred a book in between, but I definitely would read other stuff by this author. For a book about a band or musical group, I went with Larger Than Life by Maria Sherman. It's about all of the boy bands and the history of them and the psychology of being in a boy band fandom. Loved that, brought back some memories. For a book with a character on the ace spectrum, I went with Cold Blooded by Decca Nye. I don't think it's a reference to the actual ace character. His sexuality and the budding romance was actually the cutest part about all of this. The rest of it was a little bit too preachy, but did like the romance part. Next up is a book with a recipe in it. I thought this one was going to be hard, but then I read Tending Bridges Flame by Linnea Weatherstone. I am in the early info gathering days of paganism, and this one has a lot of recipes in it. Don't know if I'll actually use any of them, but I read the book, so it counts. Up next, we have a book you can read in one sitting. This one was Glorious Day by Skye Calayan. I actually read this in my sister's car while we were waiting for a concert to start, and we sat there reading for so long that the battery died. That was a fun night. Next up, we have a book about a secret. And of course, we have The Poison Heart by Kaylin Bayron. This is about a giant secret, which obviously I'm not going to spoil, but it's like, secret histories of the adopted protagonist that I really enjoyed. Although I don't know if I'm going to be continuing with the series or not. Again, I have so many series. Up next is a book with a misleading title. For this one, I went with Run Girl by Sammy Goldberg. This is a YA thriller, and I can't really reference why the title is misleading without spoiling things, but basically the protagonist hears this repeated phrase from her father way back in the day from like old traumatic memories, and once that is put in context of what it means, it changes the game. So it is kind of misleading. For a Hugo Award winner, I went with Red Shirts by John Scalzi. I've recently discovered John Scalzi's more satirical, humorous work, and I really like it. Don't know if I'm going to delve into his high fantasy stuff, but this one was essentially what if the side characters in Star Trek gained a sentience, and I loved it. It was great. Up next, we had a book set during a holiday. This one I picked Just One More by Jodie Slaughter. This is actually set during Valentine's Day. I thought that was a nice change of holiday. And Miracle of Miracles, no one hates Valentine's Day in this book. No one is like, you mean St. Hallmark's Day? Like, no, they both actually liked Valentine's Day. It was a delightful change. Then we had a different book by an author you read in 2021. I went with Poseidon by Carly Spade. I had been reading her books off of the ARC sites for review. However, this book was another kind of mid for me in the series, and there's just been enough mid books for me in the series that I'm like, I don't need to fight for the arcs anymore. I'm just going to let that one go. Then we had a book with the name of a board game in the title. I literally just looked for anything that had the words like life or risk in it, and I went with High Risk Homosexual by Edgar Gomez. This is a memoir all about high-risk homosexual kind of coming into his own. It was really sweet. Then we had a book featuring a man-made disaster. I read Pinhole by Matthew Kiggle, reviewed it. I've reviewed this author before, and in this case, it was a disaster caused by time travel shenanigans. Gotta love it. A book with a quote from your favorite author on the Amazon page. This one was tricky because most indie authors don't blurb each other's work a ton, but then I found out that Frady Smoon blurbed Angels Before Man by Rafael Nicolas. This is a queer retelling of the fall of Lucifer, which makes sense because Frady Smoon also writes a lot in Latin-based religious trauma, so it fits really well. And yes, it was sad and very magical realism-y. My brain kind of skipped over entire paragraphs because it just didn't register, but I did like the drama and angst of it. The audio cut out here for some reason, but this next prompt is for a social horror book. I read The Stepford Wives by Ira Levin, one of those books where the movie probably outshines it in popularity, and this one honestly felt slightly overhyped. I thought it could have had a lot more meat on its bones, but it was pretty good. Then we had a book set in Victorian times. I read A Lady of Rooksgrove Manor by Catherine Moon, and I love it. Polycule with monsters. I put the third book in the series on my anticipated reads list for 2023. We had a book with a constellation on the cover or in the title. The Orchid and the Lion by Gabriel Hargrave had a constellation on the cover. Went with that. Loved that one, all the trans queer goodness. Then we had a book you know nothing about. I went with Serafina by Rachel Hartman. I'd picked this up from a secondhand bookstore knowing next to nothing about it and hadn't heard about it. Was pretty good, liked it, might continue it. I think it's only a duology. Then we had, a book about gender identity, and I read I Have Always Been Me by Precious Brady Davis. This is a trans woman's memoir. We had a book featuring a party. For this one, I read Lore Olympus by Rachel Smythe. Don't know if I'll continue it. I don't know that I get all of the hype of it. Cool art style, though. Next up, we had an Own Voices science fiction and fantasy book. Not the biggest fan of the phrase Own Voices, but I get what they were going for. And this one I read Type 1 Undead by A.H. Haga. This is a series of disability in the zombie apocalypse written by a disabled author. Loved everyone. This one specifically, if you can tell by the title, deals with what would it be like to be diabetic in a world where insulin is no longer readily available. Next up, we had a book that fulfills your favorite prompt from a past PopSugar Reading challenge. Not gonna lie, I kind of faked this one. I think I went with a book that starts with X, Y, or Z just so I could read Czar by Elena Kahn. This is an alien romance. Has to deal with a lot of forced sexual relations, so be on the lookout for that. However, It's hard to explain, but it's not sexual assault as you may be thinking about it. I didn't continue with that series, but that's mostly because I'm really, really picky about the series I start this year. Next up, we are back to the advanced prompts, a book about someone leading a double life, Charade by Lisa Marie Rice. This is, again, a random romance ebook I had on my Kindle already that I read about a dude that's like, looks like a billionaire, but is secretly like the part of this secret society of freedom fighter types. I don't know. Not that great, honestly. A lot of thinly veiled conservative values in it. Then we had a book featuring a parallel reality. I read The Kaiju Preservation Society by John Scalzi. This is actually the first one that I was recommended by John Scalzi, specifically to break a reading slump, and I loved it. Lighthearted, action-adventure, family-friendly, like popcorn movie tone to it. Awesome. Then we had a book with two POVs, Friends to Lovers by Christy Barth, a Friends to Lovers romance, I think set in Australia, and I think having to do with an animal rescue. Again, it was one of those, oh, it fits, so I read it, but I wasn't like that invested in it. I probably should change that in 2023. After double checking the synopsis, it has nothing to do with an animal shelter. I was thinking of a totally different book. This one involves a wedding planner. You can see how well that story stuck in my brain. Then we had books set in sister cities, meaning that it's a weird thing. Sister cities in America and across the world is when two cities basically decide we're besties now, and they do like cross-promotional touristy stuff. So I basically went with the biggest cities. So for the first sister cities, I went with New York, and I read One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. Haven't read Red, White, and Royal Blue, but this one, perfection. A love letter to the queer community in every way. Adored it. It was great. I don't know that I'll go back and read Red, White, and Royal Blue, but I probably will read whatever Casey McQuiston puts out next. And for the last book in the sister cities, I went with London, which is where this book is partially set, and I read Imprudence by GAIL CARRIGER. Love it. Steampunky, continues to be such sarcastic, satirical fun. And that is the entire list of all the books I read for the PopSugar Reading Challenge. And that is it. I have won my PopSugar Reading Challenge for 2022 for the first time, and I am super excited for 2023. Like I mentioned before, a lot of those prompts seem catered to me specifically, and also seem like someone's been paying attention to the publishing news of traditional publishing this past year. Although I am a little nervous about how to find a book that was written during NaNoWriMo. Regardless, if you've ever participated in the PopSugar Reading Challenge or any reading challenge, let me know. Did you have to come up with any strategies to finish it? Have you had to use any weird ways of finding recommendations? I'd love to know more about that. But with nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.